I bought the place because it was broken, because the price was laughably low, and because somewhere between the county courthouse records and an old deed I'd found stacked in a rusty filing cabinet, there was a line that said my name, Mason Reed, and that, to me, meant somebody else's problem until it became mine. The first morning I pulled up to Black Hollow Lake, the sun was a slab of honest gold on the water, and the cabin looked like it had been through 3 winters and a bad marriage. But I stood there in the truck bed, rain on my boots, and thought, this is mine, and that's a feeling that fills your chest up the way a good solemn church hymn fills a room, quiet and stubborn. It didn't take long for the trouble to find me. 2 days later, a silver SUV that didn't belong to anyone who lived on the road pulled into my drive, and a woman stepped out with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a clipboard like she was talking to contractors, not the man who'd just inherited a lifetime of work. You're on private property, she said, crisp, rehearsed. This community doesn't allow. The words came packaged, neat and official, and she handed me a pamphlet that smelled like printed threats. Her name was Lorna Whitcomb, and she wore the kind of blouse that meant meetings and committee votes and 1,000 small cruelties dressed up as rules. I remember thinking, then and there, that this wasn't about covenants or HOA bylaws, at least not first. It was about control, about who gets to decide what belongs where, and who gets to smile politely while they take the curtains from your porch. My response was simple. I said, I bought this place fair and square, and she cocked her head like I'd told a joke she didn't get. Records will speak for themselves, she said. She kept smiling. I didn't. For a while, the harassment was little things that felt huge to me. My solar panels were cut loose one night. My porch camera vanished. The gate at the road was chained when neighbors said it never had been before. Tools left on my lawn, not mine, so I'd wake up and think I'd misremembered where I'd put things. I'd find chicken wire stretched across the driveway like a petty barricade. The kind of nuisance that keeps piling up until you either get used to it or snap. I called Colton, my old partner from the task force. Colton's the kind of man who listens and then looks at you like he's already reading between the lines. He came out with a toolbox and a battered coffee thermos and a look that said he was ready to be angry for me. He rigged cameras the way a fisherman rigs nets, carefully, industriously, and when the next midnight visit happened, we had footage that made my stomach flip and made me glad we'd put those little black boxes up. Men in dark jackets, faces curtained by caps, moving like they owned the night, and one of them carrying a handheld radio the way some people carry rosaries. We caught them on thermal, on infrared. We watched them. That mattered. Evidence matters. People who do things like chain your gate and steal your camera don't expect to be known and seen and cataloged. They want the comfort of anonymity. When the footage showed a man dropping a paper map onto my porch with neighborhoods circled in ink, with a list of problem properties, with an address that matched mine and other names I'd never heard, but which belonged to people on the far edges of town, that's when it stopped feeling like a dispute and started feeling like an organized campaign. That's when Lorna's smile got sharper. She started showing up at community events, at the farmer's market, at church bake sales, as if to remind everyone she was the kind person who protected the neighborhood, the one who kept values neat. But her phone glowed at her like a loaded gun. Behind that smile were emails and shell companies and a long, slow strategy. Pressure, isolation, attrition. Make living here unbearable. Make people sell, or better yet, make them think they'd never had a right to begin with. The fairness of it was a lie. The motive was money and power, and that bitter taste of being able to control someone else's life by deciding they're unfit to live in it. There were moments that felt like ordinary cruelty and moments that felt like crossing a line. One afternoon, a pickup truck with no plates pulled into my yard, and 2 men stomped out like they were going to take my generator, and one of them shoved me and said, "You don't belong here, Reed." He said it like it was a fact, like he'd read a biography and decided the main character didn't fit. I remember the sound of the generator coughing and the weight of the man's hand on my chest. It was enough to make my world narrow down to breath, and then to the sound of Colton's boots on the deck and someone yelling for them to get out. They left, and I was shaking, but I wasn't broken. Not yet. We started carefully turning evidence into pressure. We took video to the local paper. We filed a complaint with the county. We showed the thermal footage to an attorney who looked at it, and then at me like he'd seen this before, and he had. Legal names change, corporations shuffle, but patterns are patterns. He said, "You've got a record. Keep collecting." So we did. The most cinematic thing, and I only use that word because life felt like a movie in the worst possible way, was the night we baited them. We set up lights, old speakers, a cheap camera on a tripod that was meant to look like a weather monitor, and the whole cabin hummed with a fake vacancy. A fake vacation posted on social media, a staged low-profile absence. One of them, an operative named Craig in our footage, slipped on a bank of loose gravel and dropped a radio that had a frequency pre-programmed, a frequency that, when we traced it, matched a security contractor who'd been hired by the HOA without the community's full knowledge. Craig cursed. He looked at the camera like a man caught mid-theft catches a light. He tried to run. Colton blocked him, and I remember the way Craig's face went from tough to small in a handful of breaths. The radio had messages on it, short and ugly timestamps, coordinates, names, stuff you don't expect to find in a private property row. We called the sheriff. The aftermath was messy, as it always is when the powerful are exposed. Lorna disowned the contractor, like a politician disowning a scandal, and the contractor disowned the men, like a factory blaming a part it had shipped. But the footage had already gone to the paper, and the paper went online, and the county prosecutor put a name on an investigation. People came forward. The neighbors who'd kept their heads down started to talk. Someone who'd been worried about fines suddenly remembered a missing fence post, and a night his mailbox was dented. At trial, the defense tried every trick: ambiguity, plausible deniability. Though we were only enforcing rules routine, but a map with addresses circled, a radio with orders, a shed full of equipment labeled operations was harder to spin. In court, under fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of fans, Lorna's composure cracked like a brittle branch. She shouted once, too loud, and the judge told her to be quiet. It was a small victory, petty and satisfying, and the kind that made you forget how many nights you'd spent awake worrying about what would happen next. We won some things: restraining orders, a settlement that paid for repairs, a judge's order naming the HOA committee's actions illegal, but we didn't get everything. Some people sold under pressure before the case started. Some relationships in that town were permanently scorched. Power, once exercised, leaves scars. Still, the cabin stood, patched and stronger, and somewhere between the repaired porch swing and the new fence, I put a list together and started making guides for neighbors, for people who had no one to call when their property rights were eroded. I started making videos about the paperwork that matters, about how to document, how to be boring and methodical and a little annoying so the system can't push you out. The satisfying flicker of victory wears off faster than you'd expect. The town had conversations that were quiet and vicious about loyalty and gossip and old grudges. Some neighbors who helped us were ostracized by others who thought we'd made life harder for them. There were people who called me a troublemaker, who blamed me for making the town look bad. I felt, in that moment, like I'd torn a curtain and exposed all the dust behind it, necessary, but embarrassing for everyone involved. That's the weird part about justice. It cleans, but it also unsettles. I'll tell you what I learned, because this is the part that sits in my chest like a pebble. Rules look noble when you say them in tidy sentences, but when they're used as clubs by people who want to keep the world exactly as it benefits them, they stop being noble. Ownership, rights, community, they're complicated and messy, and they need people willing to be the kind of boring that doesn't let them be stolen. You don't fight well if you're dramatic. You fight well if you are organized. Take pictures, write down dates, make copies, file them in 3 places. That's not glamorous. It works. The ending wasn't cinematic fireworks. There was no last-minute confession under rain and spotlights. The end was quieter, a sentencing, a slow redistribution of power in meetings that smelled like coffee and old folding chairs, neighbors who met each other halfway, and others who never did. We had closure, not catharsis. And that's exactly why I'm telling you this now, because these fights don't stay neat in courtrooms. They keep living in kitchens and comment sections, in the ways people speak to their neighbors, and in the records they keep or throw away. So tell me, what would you have done? Would you gather footage and face down a smile like hers? Or would you sign away and save your peace? Is peace the same as surrender when someone else writes the rules for you? Leave a comment, share your story, maybe share a tip for someone who's just starting to feel like their home is slipping away. If you like this, hit share. Let somebody hear it who needs to know they aren't the only one.